She called him pathetic. Right there in the middle of the Rosewood Country Club's annual charity gala, with 500 witnesses watching in stunned silence. Elena Winters, heiress, socialite, the woman who'd once promised to spend her life with him, looked at Damien Cross and spoke those words like they were carved in stone. "You're pathetic, Damien, a failed entrepreneur clinging to past glory. I can't believe I wasted 3 years on someone who amounted to nothing." What Elena didn't know, what nobody in that ballroom knew, was that the man she just humiliated owned the building they were standing in. He owned the country club. He owned the hotel next door, the shopping district down the street, and 37% of the commercial real estate in the entire city. Damien Cross wasn't a failed entrepreneur. He was the shadow investor behind half the development projects that had transformed the city over the past decade. But he'd kept it hidden, deliberately, carefully, because 5 years ago, when his tech startup had publicly failed and his reputation had collapsed, Damien had made a choice. He decided to disappear from the spotlight and rebuild in silence. He'd wanted to know who would stand with him when he had nothing, and who would abandon him the moment his status evaporated. The answer had devastated him then. It motivated him now. Elena had left him 2 weeks after the startup collapsed. No conversation, no explanation, just a text message that read, "I need to be with someone who matches my ambitions. I'm sorry." Within a month, she was dating Marcus Henley, a venture capitalist with inherited wealth and social connections. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Damien had watched it all happen from the margins, invisible and grieving. But grief had transformed into strategy. Using the remaining capital from selling his failed company's assets and a loan from the one person who believed in him, his mentor, James Liu, Damien had started investing in distressed real estate. Properties nobody wanted, neighborhoods people had written off, commercial spaces considered too risky. He bought them quietly through shell corporations, renovated them strategically, and watched their value multiply. 10 years of disciplined investing had turned him into one of the wealthiest men in the city. But nobody knew. The properties were owned by LLCs with anonymous names. The development companies he funded operated independently. Damien himself lived in a modest apartment, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and worked from a small office that looked more like a storage closet than a command center for a real estate empire. He'd become invisible by design, and invisibility had given him clarity. Now, standing in the ballroom where Elena had just publicly humiliated him, Damien felt something shift. The tests he'd been running for the past 18 months were reaching their conclusion. It was time to stop being invisible. But first, he needed to understand exactly who these people were when they thought he was powerless. The first test had been Elena herself. 3 months ago, she'd reached out after years of silence. Her marriage to Marcus was falling apart. His family fortune was being investigated for fraud, and his social status was crumbling. Elena had sent a carefully worded message. "I've been thinking about you, about us. I made a terrible mistake. Can we talk?" Damien had agreed to meet. He'd watched as Elena performed the role of repentant lover, apologizing for leaving, claiming she'd never stopped caring about him, suggesting they could start over. But Damien had noticed something crucial. She never asked about his well-being. She never inquired about his struggles or his recovery. Every conversation circled back to her needs, her situation, her desire for stability. He'd tested her with a fabricated story about considering a small business venture. Nothing major, just enough to live comfortably. Her enthusiasm had evaporated instantly. "Maybe you should focus on finding stable employment first," she'd suggested. "Building wealth takes time." The irony was suffocating. The second test involved Marcus Henley, Elena's soon-to-be ex-husband. Marcus had approached Damien at a networking event, not recognizing him at first, then dismissing him when he did. But later, when Marcus needed an investor for a desperate last-minute project to salvage his reputation, he'd reached out. The pitch had been condescending, the terms exploitative, the underlying message clear. Marcus saw Damien as a potential fool, to be used and discarded. The third test was Monica Chun, his former business partner. When their startup had failed, Monica had blamed Damien publicly, claiming his leadership failures had destroyed their company. She'd rebuilt her career by distancing herself from him, even going so far as to give interviews where she positioned herself as a competent partner held back by Damien's incompetence. But 6 months ago, Monica had contacted him. She had a new venture and needed capital. Her message had been blunt. "I know we had difficulties, but I think we could work together again if you're interested in investing." No apology, no acknowledgement of the damage she'd caused, just transactional opportunism. The fourth test was different. It involved James Liu, the mentor who'd given Damien his first loan when nobody else would. James had never asked for repayment. He'd simply believed in Damien's character, in his potential, in his ability to rebuild. Over the years, Damien had quietly repaid the loan 10 times over through anonymous gifts, funding James's daughter's medical school education, paying off James's mortgage, ensuring James's retirement was secure. But James didn't know Damien was behind it. The test was whether James would remain kind and supportive even when he thought Damien had nothing to offer. James had passed every time. His encouragement never wavered. His belief never faltered. His friendship never became transactional. And then there was Sophia. Sophia worked as a barista at the coffee shop Damien frequented every morning. She had no idea who he was beyond, the quiet guy who orders black coffee and tips well. They developed an easy friendship, small conversations about books, about life, about dreams. Sophia was studying architecture at night, while working full-time to support her younger brother's education. She had ambition, but it was grounded in something deeper than status. She wanted to design affordable housing, to create spaces that gave people dignity. When Damien had mentioned he was between opportunities, Sophia's response had been immediate. "That's tough. If you need any connections, my roommate works in HR at a few companies. I could ask around." She'd offer help without judgment, without calculation. It was pure human kindness. Now, standing in the ballroom at the Rosewood Country Club, Damien understood the full picture. Elena had revealed herself as transactional. Marcus had shown his contempt. Monica had demonstrated her opportunism. But James and Sophia, they'd shown him that character exists independently of circumstance. Tonight was the charity gala. Tomorrow will be the city council meeting where a major development proposal will be voted on, a proposal that would determine the future of several downtown properties. What nobody in this room knew was that Damien owned those properties through his network of LLCs. What they also didn't know was that he'd orchestrated the conditions that would force tonight's revelation. If you're drawn to stories about hidden power and the moment when truth rewrites everything people thought they knew, make sure you're subscribed. Because what happens next will shatter comfortable illusions and reveal who these people truly are when the invisible man becomes impossible to ignore. Damien's journey into invisibility had started with public destruction. 10 years ago, his tech startup, Vision Sync, a platform designed to revolutionize project management for creative teams, had been the darling of the tech world. Venture capitalists fought to invest. Tech publications called him a visionary. Elena had been by his side at every launch event, every investor meeting, every moment of rising glory. She loved being the girlfriend of the next big thing. Then came the security breach, a massive data leak that exposed client information across 17 major companies. The media crucifixion was immediate. Lawsuits piled up. Investors pulled funding. Within 6 weeks, Vision Sync was bankrupt. Damien's reputation was demolished, and Elena was gone. What the public never knew, what the media never reported, was that the breach hadn't been Damien's fault. It had been Monica's. She'd ignored Damien's repeated warnings about infrastructure vulnerabilities, prioritizing rapid growth over security protocols. But when everything collapsed, Monica had positioned herself as a victim of Damien's incompetent leadership. She'd given interviews, written blog posts, built an entire personal brand around being the competent partner, destroyed by someone else's failures. Damien had considered fighting back, exposing the truth, defending his reputation. But his mentor James had given him different advice during their final meeting, before Damien disappeared from public life. Reputation is noise, James had said. Character is signal. You can spend years fighting for your reputation, or you can spend years building your character. Only one of those things will actually matter in the end. Damien had chosen character. He'd taken the remaining liquidated assets from Vision Sync, approximately $300,000, and a $200,000 loan from James, and he started investing in the one asset class nobody else wanted, distressed commercial real estate in overlooked neighborhoods. His first purchase had been an abandoned warehouse in the Riverside district, a neighborhood most investors considered too risky, too poor, too far from the city center to ever appreciate in value. Damien had seen something different. He'd seen families, small businesses, people with potential but no opportunity. He'd renovated the warehouse into affordable commercial spaces for local entrepreneurs. Hair salons, restaurants, art studios, mechanics, businesses that served the community rather than exploiting it. The returns had been modest at first. But Damien wasn't optimizing for maximum profit. He was optimizing for sustainable growth and community impact. And something unexpected happened. The businesses thrived. The community stabilized. Property values began rising. Within 3 years, that single warehouse investment had quintupled in value. Damien replicated the model. He bought neglected properties, renovated them thoughtfully, rented them affordably, and watched communities transform. His portfolio grew silently, strategically, invisibly. By year 5, he owned significant real estate across 7 neighborhoods. By year 10, he was one of the largest commercial property owners in the city. But he'd maintained absolute anonymity. Every property was owned through LLCs with names like Riverside Holdings Group or Downtown Development Partners. He employed property managers to handle day-to-day operations. He never appeared at public events, never gave interviews, never claimed credit for the neighborhoods he'd helped revitalize. Invisibility had protected him, but it had also revealed something crucial about human nature. People treat you completely differently when they think you have nothing to offer. The test had begun 18 months ago, carefully orchestrated to reveal character in its purest form. Test 1, Elena's return. When she'd reached out claiming she'd made a mistake, Damien had decided to test the sincerity of her regret. Over 3 months of periodic meetings, he presented himself as someone still struggling to rebuild. He'd mentioned small business ideas, talked about working freelance consulting gigs, described a modest lifestyle. He'd watched Elena's body language shift from engaged to disappointed, from hopeful to resigned. During their final coffee meeting, Elena had been direct. "I think you need to be realistic about your prospects, Damien. You're 42 years old. Most people your age have established careers. Maybe it's time to accept a more modest life path." What she meant was, "You're no longer useful to my ambitions." But the real test had come when Damien had manufactured a scenario. He'd mentioned that a friend had offered him a partnership opportunity that required a $50,000 investment. "It's risky," he'd said, "but it could be transformative." Elena's response had been immediate. "You can't afford that kind of risk. You need stability, not gambling." What she didn't say, but Damien heard clearly, was that she wouldn't support risk because she needed security. Test 2, Marcus's desperation. Marcus Henley's family fortune was collapsing under federal investigation for tax fraud and embezzlement. His social status, the only thing Elena had married him for, was evaporating. Marcus had approached Damien with a proposal: invest $2 million in a luxury condo development, take a minority stake, and Marcus would handle everything else. Damien had reviewed the proposal. It was exploitative, structured to give Marcus majority control while exposing investors to maximum risk. The underlying message was clear. Marcus saw Damien as desperate enough to accept terrible terms. Damien had asked strategic questions. What happens if the project fails? Marcus's answer: that's the risk of investment. You'd lose your capital. And what would happen to Marcus? He'd already structured the deal to protect himself through liability shields and management fees guaranteed regardless of outcomes. The test revealed everything. Marcus was willing to exploit Damien's perceived desperation for his own protection. Test 3, Monica's opportunism. Monica Chun had built a successful consulting firm by positioning herself as an expert in technology project management, the same expertise Damien had developed before Vision Sync's collapse. She'd reached out 6 months ago with a proposal. She had a major client who needed help with a complex project, and she wanted Damien to do the actual work as a subcontractor while she maintained a client relationship and took the majority of fees. "I think this could be good for both of us," Monica had said during their meeting. "You get back into the industry. I get reliable execution. Win-win." Damien had asked about credit. Would the client know I'm involved? Monica's response was immediate. "I think it's better if we keep the arrangement between us. Client prefer continuity, and my brand is already established." Translation: she wanted Damien's expertise without giving him any path back to professional credibility. She would benefit from his work while keeping him invisible. It was exploitation dressed up as opportunity. Test 4. James's consistency. This was the test Damien cared about most. Over 10 years, James had remained consistently supportive despite receiving nothing in return. When Damien had struggled, James had offered encouragement. When Damien had seemed to make progress, James had celebrated without trying to extract value. When Damien had appeared to stagnate, James had simply remained present. The anonymous gifts Damien had sent, the medical school funding, the mortgage payoff, the retirement security, had never changed James's behavior. Because James didn't know they came from Damien, there was no transactional gratitude, no expectation of continued support. James was simply a good person choosing to be kind to someone he believed in. Test 5. Sophia's humanity. This test was unintentional, but perhaps most revealing. Sophia had no idea who Damien was beyond the quiet, regular customer. Their friendship had developed organically. Conversations about books, about dreams, about the struggle of building something meaningful in a world obsessed with shortcuts. When Damien had mentioned he was between opportunities, Sophia's immediate response was to help, not because she expected anything in return, but because that's who she was. She'd offered connections, advice, encouragement. She treated Damien's struggle as legitimate rather than as evidence of his unworthiness. One morning, Sophia had shown Damien her architecture designs, affordable housing concepts that prioritize human dignity over maximum density. "I know it's not as profitable as luxury condos," she'd said, "but I think housing should be about giving people a foundation, not extracting maximum rent." Damien had recognized something in that moment. Sophia shared his values. She measured success by impact rather than extraction. And she had no idea that the man sitting across from her owned dozens of properties built on that exact philosophy. Now, the final test was in motion. Tomorrow's city council meeting would vote on a controversial development proposal. The proposal involved demolishing several older buildings in the Riverside district to make way for luxury high-rises. The development group pushing the proposal was well-funded, politically connected, and aggressive. What they didn't know was that Damien owned those buildings through his network of LLCs. And what the city council didn't know was that Damien had a counterproposal, a plan to preserve the buildings, renovate them sustainably, and create mixed-income housing that would serve the existing community rather than displacing it. Tonight's charity gala was the stage. Tomorrow's council meeting was the revelation. And everyone who tested Damien's character was about to discover that the powerless man they dismissed actually controlled the outcome of one of the most significant development decisions in the city's recent history. Elena was about to learn that the pathetic man she'd humiliated owned the venue where she'd humiliated him. Marcus was about to discover that his desperate investment pitch had been to someone wealthier than his family had ever been. Monica was about to realize that the subcontractor role she'd offered was to the man who could have bought her entire consulting firm without noticing the expense. And James and Sophia, they were about to learn that kindness creates bonds that wealth can never buy. The revelation began not with a speech, but with a document. The next morning, Damien walked into the city council chambers wearing a tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His presence was unremarkable. Another developer, another proposal, another agenda item in a long meeting. The council members barely glanced at him as he took his seat in the public comment section. Elena was there, sitting in the gallery with Marcus. They'd come to support the luxury development proposal because Marcus's family had a financial stake in the project, one of their desperate attempts to salvage their crumbling fortune. Elena had seen Damien enter, but had deliberately looked away, still riding the high of last night's public humiliation. Monica was there as a consultant for the development group, prepared to present data supporting the demolition and rebuild. She'd built her presentation around projections of maximum density, maximum return, maximum extraction of value from the Riverside district. She hadn't noticed Damien at all. The council meeting proceeded through preliminary items, zoning adjustments, permit approvals, budget discussions. Then came Agenda Item 7, Riverside District Development Proposal. The development group presented first. Glossy renderings of glass towers, promises of tax revenue, projections of economic growth. They spoke about revitalizing a struggling neighborhood and bringing investment to an underutilized area. What they meant was displacing the existing community to build luxury housing for wealthy outsiders. Monica presented the economic analysis. Her data was professionally packaged, but fundamentally misleading. She'd cherry-picked statistics that made the neighborhood look economically depressed while ignoring the thriving small businesses, the stable families, the community infrastructure that already existed. Her recommendation was unequivocal: demolish and rebuild. Then it was time for public comment. The council chair called for opposition statements. Several community members spoke: small business owners, longtime residents, people whose lives would be destroyed by the proposal. Their testimonies were emotional, heartfelt, and strategically ineffective. The council members listened politely, but their body language suggested the decision had already been made. Then Damien stood up. He walked to the podium with a leather folder in his hand. He placed it on the lectern and looked directly at the council members. My name is Damien Cross. I'm here to present an alternative proposal for the Riverside District. Elena's head snapped up. Marcus froze. Monica's expression shifted from boredom to confusion. Before I begin, Damien continued, I need to clarify something about the properties in question. The development group has presented this proposal as if they have the authority to proceed. They don't. They don't own the properties. I do. The room went silent. Damien opened the folder and distributed packets to each council member. These documents show the ownership structure of every building the development group wants to demolish. Riverside Holdings Group, Downtown Development Partners, Community First Properties. These are all entities I control. The properties aren't for sale. They won't be demolished. Instead, I'm proposing a different approach. He clicked a remote, and a presentation appeared on the screen behind him. Not glossy renderings of glass towers, but thoughtful renovations of existing buildings. Plans for mixed-income housing, designs for community spaces that preserve the neighborhood's character while improving infrastructure. Over the past 10 years, Damien said, his voice calm and measured, I've invested approximately $400 million in this city's overlooked neighborhoods, not to extract maximum value, but to build sustainable communities. The Riverside District has seen property values increase by 300% during that time. Small businesses have thrived. Families have stabilized. Crime has dropped by 40%. This isn't a struggling neighborhood that needs saving. This is a successful neighborhood that needs protection. Elena's face had gone pale. Marcus looked like he'd been struck. Monica was staring at the presentation with an expression of dawning horror. The development group's proposal would displace approximately 2,000 residents and destroy 47 small businesses. My counterproposal preserves the existing community while adding 500 units of mixed-income housing, upgrading infrastructure, and creating community spaces that serve existing residents rather than replacing them. Damien paused, letting the information settle. Then he looked directly at Monica. I've reviewed the economic analysis presented by Chun Consulting. It's fundamentally flawed. The data excludes thriving businesses, ignores property value appreciation, and presents a deliberately misleading picture of economic depression. I'm submitting a corrected analysis that shows the true economic health of the Riverside District. Monica's hands were shaking. She'd just been publicly called out for professional malpractice by someone she dismissed as a failure. Damien turned to the council members. I'm not asking you to choose between development and preservation. I'm asking you to choose between extraction and investment, between displacement and dignity, between short-term profit and long-term community health. My proposal offers all the economic benefits the development group promises, without destroying the community that already exists. He closed the folder. The properties aren't for sale. The neighborhood isn't negotiable. But I'm open to partnership with anyone who shares these rather than extracting value from them. Thank you for your time. Damien walked back to his seat. The council chambers erupted in chaos. Community members who'd been testifying in desperation were suddenly hopeful. The development group's lawyers were frantically conferring, and Elena, Marcus, and Monica were processing the impossible reality that the man they dismissed, humiliated, and exploited was actually the most powerful person in the room. The council chair called for order. Mr. Cross, you're claiming ownership of properties that the development group has presented as available for acquisition. Can you verify these claims? Damien pulled out his phone and made a single call. James, can you confirm ownership documentation for the Riverside properties? Yes, send it to the council's legal team directly. Within minutes, the council's attorneys confirmed it. Every property in question was owned by Damien's network of LLCs. The development proposal was dead on arrival, but Damien wasn't finished. He stood again and addressed the room. I want to be clear about something. I've been operating invisibly for 10 years, not because I was hiding, but because I was testing. I wanted to understand who people truly are when they think you have nothing to offer. And what I've learned is that character reveals itself most clearly in how people treat those they perceive as powerless. He turned to Elena. Last night, you called me pathetic. You humiliated me in front of 500 people because you believed I was powerless to respond. What you didn't know was that I owned the building you were standing in. I own the country club. I own 37% of the commercial real estate in this city. But more importantly, I learned something about your character. You measure people's worth by their status. You're only interested in connection when it benefits your ambitions. That's not love. That's transaction. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of humiliation rather than genuine remorse. Damien turned to Marcus. You approached me with an investment proposal designed to exploit my perceived desperation. You structured the deal to protect yourself while exposing me to maximum risk. You treated me like a fool because you thought I had no other options. But I have more options than you can imagine, and I have no interest in doing business with people who operate through exploitation rather than partnership. Marcus stood up to leave, but Damien's voice stopped him. The federal investigation into your family's finances? I provided the initial documentation to the SEC, not out of revenge, but because your family's tax fraud has been stealing from the communities I've been investing in. Justice isn't personal. It's necessary. Monica tried to shrink in her seat, but Damien addressed her next. You've built your career on positioning yourself as the competent partner destroyed by my incompetence. You've given interviews, written articles, created an entire professional brand around that narrative. But you and I both know the truth. The security breach that destroyed Vision Sync happened because you ignored my warnings about infrastructure vulnerabilities. You prioritized growth over security, and when it collapsed, you blamed me publicly while rebuilding privately. I could have fought back 10 years ago. I chose not to. But I want you to know I've documented everything. Every warning I gave you, every decision you made, every interview where you lied about what happened. I've had that documentation for a decade, and I've never used it. Not because I couldn't, but because I was curious to see if you'd ever choose honesty over opportunism. You never did. Monica's face crumpled, but Damien wasn't cruel in his revelation. He was simply truthful. Then Damien's expression softened. He looked toward the back of the room where James Liu had entered, having rushed from his office to deliver the ownership documentation. James, Damien said, you gave me a loan when nobody else would. You believed in my character when the world believed I was a failure. You never asked for repayment, never leveraged our friendship for personal gain, never treated me differently based on my circumstances. I want you to know I've been repaying you for 10 years. Your daughter's medical school? That was me. Your mortgage payoff? Me. Your retirement fund? Me. And I never told you because I didn't want gratitude. I wanted to honor the kindness you showed me when I had nothing. James's eyes went wide, then filled with tears. He started to speak, but emotion caught in his throat. Finally, Damien looked at someone in the gallery, Sophia, who'd come to the meeting out of civic interest, not knowing Damien would be there. Sophia, you and I have been having coffee for 6 months. You have no idea who I am beyond a regular customer. You've never asked me for anything, never tried to leverage our friendship, never treated me differently based on what you thought I could offer. You showed me your architecture designs, affordable housing built on dignity rather than extraction. I want you to know those designs are brilliant, and I'm offering you something, not because of friendship, but because of talent. I want you to lead the architectural redesign of the Riverside District renovation, full creative control, significant equity stake, and a mandate to build housing that honors people rather than displaces them. Sophia stood slowly, processing, her hands trembling. The room was in complete chaos now. But beneath the noise, something fundamental had shifted. The invisible man wasn't invisible anymore, and everyone who'd tested his character was facing the results of their own tests. The council vote was unanimous. Damien's proposal was approved with full support. The Luxury Development Group withdrew their plans within 24 hours, their financial backing evaporating once it became clear they had no path forward. Marcus Henley's family stake in the project became another loss in their cascade of legal and financial failures. Within 3 months, Marcus's family would declare bankruptcy. Marcus himself would face federal charges. But the real story unfolded in the weeks and months that followed, in the private reckonings of the people Damien had tested. Elena's transformation was the most painful to watch. She'd spent 2 weeks after the council meeting in complete denial, convinced that Damien's revelation was somehow a performance, a trick, an elaborate revenge fantasy. But as the media coverage expanded, articles about the mysterious investor who'd been quietly revitalizing neglected neighborhoods, profiles of Damien's strategic approach to community-focused development, denial became impossible. She'd sent him a message. "I need to talk to you. Please." Damien had agreed to meet one final time at a coffee shop far from the social circles they'd once shared. Elena had arrived looking diminished, her usual confidence replaced by something rawer. "I don't know how to apologize," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I called you pathetic. I humiliated you publicly. And you were actually—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Damien had listened without interruption. Then he'd spoken carefully. "Elena, I don't need your apology. I need you to understand something about yourself. You measure people's worth by their status. You always have. When I was rising, you loved being associated with my success. When I fell, you left because I couldn't offer you the social position you wanted. And when Marcus's status crumbled, you reached back out to me, not because you genuinely reflected on your choices, but because you needed a new source of stability." Elena had started crying, but Damien continued. "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because you need to choose. Do you want to build a life based on genuine connection, or do you want to continue measuring people's worth by what they can offer your ambitions? Those are fundamentally different paths." She left that meeting without resolution. But 6 months later, Damien received a message from her. She'd started therapy. She'd ended her relationship with Marcus not because of his financial collapse, but because she'd recognized the toxicity of their dynamic. She was working on understanding why she'd built her entire identity around status rather than substance. The message wasn't asking for anything. It was simply updating him on her journey. Damien had responded, "I'm proud of you for doing this work. It takes courage to examine yourself honestly. I wish you well." He meant it. Elena's redemption wasn't about returning to him. It was about becoming someone capable of genuine connection. Marcus's story was darker. He'd initially tried to fight back against a federal investigation, hiring expensive lawyers and mounting an aggressive defense. But the evidence was overwhelming. His family's tax fraud had been systematic, sophisticated, and morally bankrupt. They'd been stealing from the city through shell companies and inflated development costs for years. During the trial, something unexpected happened. Marcus had a breakdown on the witness stand, admitting not just a fraud, but the emptiness of the life he'd built around inherited wealth and manufactured status. "I never actually built anything," he'd said, tears streaming. I just took from people and called it business." The judge had been unmoved, but Damien had watched from a gallery and felt something unexpected: compassion. Marcus was facing consequences, yes, but he was also facing himself for the first time. Damien had sent a message to Marcus's public defender. "If he's genuinely committed to rehabilitation, I'll provide character testimony supporting leniency in exchange for full restitution and community service." Marcus had accepted. He'd receive a reduced sentence, 3 years instead of 7, and had spent the time working in prison education programs, teaching financial literacy to incarcerated people. It was the first meaningful work he'd ever done. Monica's reckoning was professional. Within a week of council meeting, 3 of her major clients had terminated their contracts, unwilling to be associated with someone who'd been publicly called out for presenting misleading data. Her consulting firm had nearly collapsed. She'd contacted Damien not to apologize, but to ask for advice. "How do I rebuild?" she'd written. "I destroyed my credibility. I don't know how to move forward." Damien had responded with something unexpected. "Truth. You rebuild by telling the truth about what happened 10 years ago. You publicly acknowledge your role in Vision Sync's collapse. You admit that you blame me to protect your career. You demonstrate that character can change through honest accountability." Monica had struggled with that advice for months. Admitting the truth meant destroying professional brands she'd spent a decade building. But eventually, she'd done it. She'd written an article for a major tech publication titled, "How I Destroyed My Partner's Reputation to Save My Own Career." The piece was devastating in its honesty, acknowledging her decisions, explaining her rationalizations, and demonstrating genuine remorse. The response had been mixed. Some people praised her honesty. Others saw it as too little, too late. But something shifted in Monica's work. She started consulting for nonprofits instead of luxury developers. She began measuring her success by the communities she served rather than the fees she collected. It was a redemption, not yet, but it was a path toward it. James's story was the simplest and most beautiful. He'd been overwhelmed by the revelation that Damien had been supporting him anonymously for years. But rather than feeling indebted, James had felt confirmed. "I always knew you were someone special," James had said during their first meeting after the council revelation. "Not because of your wealth, because of your character. The money doesn't change how I see you. It just confirms what I already believed." They continued their mentorship relationship, but now it was mutual. James advised Damien on community investment strategies. Damien supported James's work with underprivileged entrepreneurs. Their bond deepened not because of transactions, but because of genuine mutual respect. And Sophia's trajectory was transformative. She'd accepted Damien's offer to lead the Riverside District architectural redesign, and her work had been extraordinary. She designed housing that balanced affordability with beauty, that honored the existing community, while improving infrastructure that created spaces for human dignity rather than maximum density. Her first project, a mixed-income apartment complex that incorporated community gardens, shared workspace, and accessible design, won national awards. But more importantly, it housed 80 families who'd previously been at risk of displacement. Sophia had proven that affordable housing didn't have to be ugly, that serving people with limited resources could still be excellent work. She and Damien had developed a genuine friendship, built on shared values and mutual respect. No romance. Neither of them wanted that. Just a professional partnership grounded in the belief that housing should serve human flourishing rather than extracting maximum rent. 3 years after the council meeting, Damien stood at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Riverside District's final renovation phase. The neighborhood had been transformed, not through displacement, but through investment. Small businesses had thrived. Families had stabilized. Property values had increased. But existing residents hadn't been priced out because Damien had implemented rent stabilization programs and affordable housing protections. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of community members, city officials, and the people whose lives have been directly impacted by Damien's decade of invisible investment. But the moment that mattered most to Damien was simple. A young girl handed him a drawing she'd made of her apartment building, with a note that read, "Thank you for not making us leave." That drawing sat framed in Damien's office. not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Wealth without purpose is empty. Power without compassion is destructive. And invisibility, chosen deliberately, can be a form of clarity that reveals who people truly are. Elena had called him pathetic in front of 500 people. She believed he was powerless, worthless, someone to be dismissed and humiliated. But she'd been wrong about everything. Damien didn't own just the building. He owned the vision of what the city could become. And he'd proven that the most powerful thing you can do is invest in people's dignity rather than extract value from their desperation. The tests were complete. The revelations had happened. And the city was better for it. Not because of revenge, but because someone had chosen to build rather than destroy, to invest rather than extract, to honor character rather than status. Before you go, I want to know, what city are you watching the story from? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening to this tale of hidden power and revealed truth. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to join our community. We share stories about people who were underestimated, dismissed, and humiliated until the moment their true power was revealed. New episodes drop weekly, and each one is a reminder that the invisible people around you might be the most powerful people you'll ever meet. Subscribe now, and don't miss a single story of redemption, revelation, and the moment when everything changes.